and it's going to be a very interesting and very important conversation. Am I ready? Okay. Welcome again. Tonight's discussion, community conversation on homelessness, poverty, how it affects us all. This is a critical issue, not only facing Vermont, but the entire country. And we're delighted to have such a distinguished panel with us tonight. We're going to be talking about how we got here, what the issues are, and possible solutions. It's really critical that we do talk about solutions and we listen to you all as well. I want to quickly introduce a few people. Joyce Marcel, who'll be our moderator. Kate O'Connor is somewhere in the room. She's executive director of the Commons. There she is over there. We also have cards on the table for people who want to ask questions. We also will be going to the audience at the end, and we want to hear from you, and we will have, Kate will be, she'll have a roving mic with her, so you can get up, introduce yourselves, and ask your question or make your comment. Hold on. Shout out to Randy Holhut, news editor of the Commons, who's here taking photos. Several members of our board are here, and we'd like them to raise their hands, make themselves known. Michael and others. We have information on the table from each of the nonprofits, or from most of the nonprofits, that people please feel free to take away. It will provide good information for you and for anyone who is looking for assistance. There's also a release over there from the World Affairs Council. There will be another event coming up in May, which will be about the Supreme Court decision with Meg Mott. And it'll be right here in the library, so that might be of interest for people. We want to thank the library for the room and for helping. Star did so much work, it's unbelievable. And of course, we want to thank our partners, Brattleboro Community Television. They will be shooting, as you know, this event. It'll also be going live streamed on YouTube as we speak, as well as live on Facebook. Now, we have a lot to discuss tonight, and let's get started. I'll introduce Joyce, and I think she'll introduce Gary, and I'm going to give him the mic.
No, I'm. No.
No.
Okay, so.
Oh,
Now you can hear me. Wait. Can you hear me now?
good.
God, I've always wanted to say that.
You had your 5 minutes.
There we are. Okay, we're ready to go.
Oh.
I wanted to say, this is Gary Stroud, who has experienced homelessness, and he's going to give us a short idea of what that feels like. I have also experienced homelessness, so I kind of know what it feels like too. But you tell them.
I have to say good evening, everybody. Thank you and all, one and all coming out here to hearing experiences from other people that are out here in our community and around that experience homelessness from all walks of life. My personal experiences from when I originally left, I don't know, it was like in Oman. I left New York after 9/11. I came up here, and then I moved up here to Brattleboro. I found an apartment and everything. My daughter was born. I wanted to make a life change, and, well, life changed me. I experienced homelessness. I was in a fire. I wound up down here at the senior center and at other community places that, you know, pretty much helped and supported me back then in '08. It was a rough time, but it was amazing how a community can come together and humanely come and help people and not look at, you know, race, creed, color, religion, sex. Just say, here's a person here doing humanitarian things, helping another person, another human, you know, come up from that. And it was a 3 months experience in the winter, January, February, March, and I'm walking around with my daughter, and the first thing she said, "Dad, when are we gonna find a place?" That is the most hard thing to deal with when a child, and she was about 4, and how do you tell a child, you know, something like that? That was my motivation to also get up and do my part to get out there and to do something too. But the support system that was out there from the drop-in center that I was, you know, getting help from at the time, and the community people, faces unknown people just coming and, you know, finally getting an apartment, you know, through my landlord, who was Harry Hoy. I've been there now 16 years, and through SEBCA and all the agencies back then, and how they helped out. And even after the fact, when I finally got myself settled in, they still ask every day, "How are you doing? How are you doing?" They didn't have to. The fire part, Peter Lynch, Melinda was asking me for help. And then going, like I said, going down to SEBCA, people like, you know, saying, "Is everything okay? How's you?" And they still remember. And now my daughter's 19, going on 30 in college, and she's up here now, and she barely remembers. She does remember that, walking around with a plastic bag in your hand from one hotel to the next, trying to find out where am I gonna live, and getting out there. But the people that came together, that didn't give up, I didn't. And after that happened, I poured out my heart and my services back to the town, volunteering at these places, at Loaves and Fishes, at the drop-in, giving back what was given to me. And that makes a difference. I just got to say one thing about homelessness: it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter your status. Life, anything can happen at any given time. A life change can happen like that, and you could just lose it all. And the way it is now, we as a community need to bond together, come together, connect, and put aside whatever indifferences and thoughts, and conversate and talk to each other. What is it we can do? You know, what can I do to help? What is it that you need from me to do my part? And not wait for others or places or government or whatever to say, you know, this and then. I just do it, you know, and I volunteer my time to take veterans to the doctors, people to wherever they need to go, grocery shopping, because I told myself, once I get out of that rut, I'm going to give back what was given to me, and it makes a difference. And you know, the love that's here in this town, boy, I tell you, what a difference. You would never think, you know, that anybody wouldn't even consider. But, you know, I wasn't stigmatized, "Oh, you're this or you're that." It's just that here's a person that's in need, and we need to do something and not think about, just do it. And they did it. And I tell you, from '08 up until now, what a difference. Now I'm on Brattleboro's Housing Partnership. I'm the District 2 chair. I work down and volunteer also, and I'm on the committee for Meals on Wheels, and I get involved. Everybody knows me. I get out in the streets and I help everybody. And if anybody ever needs me, I'm there, Johnny, on the spot, and I will not hesitate.
Okay, that's perfect.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Gary. That was amazing. I'm going to be very rude tonight. You're talking to me. We have so much to talk about. And I wanted to start out by reading a song that Woody Guthrie wrote in 1938. And it's, "I ain't got no home. I'm just a roaming round, just a wandering worker. I go from town to town, and the police make it hard wherever I may go. And I ain't got no home in this world anymore." And 1938. And the person who threw him out of his home, by the way, was Donald Trump's father. He wrote the song in honor of Fred Trump. So, okay, homelessness is, we all know the statistics. We're the second biggest homeless population in the country after California. How did that happen? How is it possible? Can we prevent it? It's a complex issue. It involves mental health. It involves drugs sometimes. It involves panhandling. Homelessness right now. But discussing right now whether we criminalize homelessness. So we've got a lot to talk about. I'm going to tell you who these people are. This is Ann Sosin. She's a public health researcher and practitioner at Dartmouth. She's also a teacher at Dartmouth. This is Mike Pieciak, who is the state treasurer. Next to him is Elizabeth Bridgewater, the executive director of the Windsor Housing Trust. Libby Bennett is next to her. She's the new director of Groundworks. And Chloe Leary is at the other end, and she is the executive director of the Winston Prouty Center. And each one of these people in turn will tell you a little bit about what they're doing and what their organization is doing. And then we have questions specifically for them. And we'll start with Ann. And what does the research show on what drives homelessness in our communities?
Thanks so much for having me here at this event. We actually know a lot about what sort of explains patterns in homelessness across the U.S. One of the common there are many common myths about homelessness and what explains it. And what the research really shows is that homelessness is fundamentally a housing pattern. When we look at the research, we see that housing supply and affordability, not local political context, substance use, mental health, climate, generosity of services explains the variations we see nationally in homelessness. And in Vermont, we see a very large gap between the supply and affordability of housing and the need in the state. And that is primarily why we see so much homelessness in Vermont. I want to add, knowing what we hear about homelessness, that we often hear about many factors and related to homelessness. We hear about substance use, we hear about mental health, and researchers have used a really nice analogy to explain what they see. They call it the musical chairs phenomenon, and we see that when there are not enough chairs or not enough houses, some people are able to find a place to sit down or to live, and others aren't. And those who struggle with substance use or mental health or other challenges have a harder time finding a chair. They may have a harder time exiting homelessness or face additional challenges, but that's not really fundamentally what explains why we see different levels of homelessness from one state or community to the next.
Could you explain a little bit more about your research and how you got to these conclusions?
Sure. So, I would speak to two things. The first is that we have a lot of research that's been done in other settings, both on what drives homelessness and what the solutions are. And so we really look to that as the starting point and think about how do we build on that in our context? How do we generate local evidence or research that can inform our action? And that's where most of my work resides. I've done research in Vermont looking at the experiences of people who are facing homelessness in our state. Much of my research has been focused in the motels, which are providing interim housing for people experiencing homelessness, and so that has added to the national evidence that we have.
The motels are a really big thing. It seems that when the pandemic hit, it was a brilliant idea to get the homeless population into the hotels because the rooms would be empty and the people would be off the street. Then nobody, it seems, at the state level, at least in this is my opinion here, nobody seemed to negotiate a price for those hotels, and it's cost us billions of dollars. And then when it came time for the program to end, it didn't seem as though anyone had prepared for that. And so they put them back in the shelters. Can you talk about the motel population? I mean, what's going on there? Ann?
Sure. So maybe just I could go back and talk about what we've learned and how
Yeah.
motels and other types of housing policy have been used during the pandemic. And I'll speak really wearing my public health hat. So Vermont, like many other parts of the U.S., used motels to provide non-congregate shelter at the onset of the pandemic. The state also had an eviction moratorium in place, and there were other, and made extensive use of housing policy. And what we have learned, and now we have a lot of research on this, is that non-congregate shelter was not only very protective for the people who were staying in it, but it helped to control transmission of COVID-19 at community level. And there's been a lot of work done across the U.S. That's really helped us to think about how do we use housing policy in the context of epidemic response. Right now, as you know, that there's a big debate going on how do we move forward with interim housing or shelter, given that we have a large and growing shortage of housing in this state. So many people have been staying in the motels. We don't have a lot of conventional shelter, and I know that Libby and Chloe and others will speak to that. But there is a challenge in how do we fill that gap in shelter or other options in our state.
Do you think, what place does government have in this? Or what would you like to see government do?
That's a very big question.
Yeah, well, Mike will be asked that question too, I think.
You know, I always try to stay focused on the research and what the research shows. You know, I think there's a real opportunity to build on the evidence and the lessons in policy making. And so my hope is that we really act on some of the lessons and some of the research and think about how do we bring that to scale given the resources that we have.
Okay. There you go. I was supposed to ask you about background on how we got to this place, and I forgot. Is it Anne?
I'm sure you want to hear from someone else.
Okay. Mike. You're on. So tell us what you do, and then I guess you have enough to say.
Yeah.
Without me, but I have questions for you afterwards.
Well, that sounds good, Joyce. Well, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's great to be back in my hometown of Brattleboro, and great to be here at the Brooks Memorial Library. Great to be on the panel with Chloe as well, since the Winston Prouty Center was really helpful in my early age, helping me learn how to speak and articulate, and that has turned out to be very important. And I went on to go to high school and college and law school and had many, many different educators throughout my life, but I can count on one hand the most important ones, and one of those is Mary Copans, who's here as well. They say all you need to learn, you learn in kindergarten, but I learned it in nursery school, so you were... And then just one more indulgence, which is that my mother is also here, Carolyn, who for 40-plus years has been founding and then helping run St. Bridget's Kitchen, and recently retired from that position. So thank you for all the work you've done for the Brattleboro community. But just to pick up from what Ann said, I think you do think of the challenge around homelessness as both structural and then individual vulnerabilities. And I was really struggling with this question of what is driving homelessness in Vermont? What is driving this problem across the country? And I was driving one day and listening to VPR, and a professor, Greg Colburn, was on a national program, and I wanted to stop the car, pull over, write his name down, and be like, who was that person? And I need to find out more information about him, because he was so clear and articulate about the problem. And I think you could look at this problem as having so many different reasons that it's happening, so many different problems that are compounding on each other. But he so clearly drives down to the core essence of it, which is what Ann talked about, not having enough homes. That analogy of the musical chairs, you have 10 people around a row, and you have 10 chairs, and everyone gets a chair when the music stops. You take a chair away, and someone is left without a chair, and you ask them afterward, you know, maybe they had a broken leg and they're on crutches, and you say, what happened? Why didn't you get a chair? And they say, well, I had this broken leg, I'm moving slowly. You know, that explains it. But that's really just their individual vulnerability. It was because we didn't have enough chairs in the first instance for everyone to get a place. So that structural challenge that we're facing is being driven here in Vermont by a number of things. One, we need more housing because we don't live together in the same way. We don't live intergenerationally. We don't get married as early. People are getting divorced. So the average house size in Vermont used to be about 3, and now it's about 2. So even with our current population, we need more housing just to maintain the population that we have. But our population has also been growing. We've had people been moving to Vermont from out of state, taking up the housing supply. That's great. We need people to move in from out of state, but that drives up housing prices and drives down the vacancy number. And then also we have an older housing stock. We haven't been investing in our housing stock for quite some time. We're starting to do that again, but it takes time to work out of that and takes time to build housing, and that's one of our other challenges. So there are a lot of things that are building to explain why in a state that has a very low vacancy rate, a very high median rent, why we have the second highest rate of homelessness. I think that's at the core of the problem.
Okay, so one of the first things you did was take or fine $55 million for housing. You want to explain to, maybe people don't know that?
Yeah, no, of course, Joyce, and we've expanded that too since then. You know, we now can do up to $115 million of housing loans. So one of the challenges that's happening in this environment is that costs keep going up and interest rates are really high. And interest rates are high because the economy is doing well, and the Federal Reserve wants interest rates to be high because they want to have the type of housing development that we need here stop because they want to slow the economy down. That's sort of the Federal Reserve and how they work. So we said, well, that's fine for a national policy, but what can we do in Vermont to sort of be counter-cyclical to that? How can we break through that sort of Federal Reserve policy? And we said, well, we have a really strong balance sheet in the state of Vermont. We have literally billions of dollars in our cash fund that we're waiting to be spent. That's going to take a long time to spend, and more money's coming in every day. So let's lend some of that money out at a low interest rate, 1 or 2%, to housing developers, affordable housing developers, so that they can continue to move forward with their projects, even in this period of high interest rate. And when the interest rates come down over the next couple of years, then we'll be back to a more normal interest rate environment where they can lend money and continue to build housing. So we've lent out just over $60 million to date. It's going to support the creation of over 900 new units of housing throughout Vermont. We have more money to be lent out and more work to be done on that, but it's a really, I think, big step, and it was the biggest lever that we could pull in our office, at the Treasurer's office, and we were eager to do that.
And where's this money going, and when are we going to see the results of some of it? This is a lot of money.
Yeah. So 2 projects in Windham County that are going to be benefited. One is the affordable housing unit up in Putney that's just off of the interstate. They had run into some delays because they had run into delays, and then because of the delays, costs had gone up, and then all of a sudden, to finance those increased costs, their interest rates were so high that it was a real challenge. So our money was able to come in at a low interest rate and help the project move forward, which was great. There's another project here, Tri-Park in West Brattleboro, where they needed money for infrastructure. They needed money to move some of the homes out of the floodplain and invest in some new, highly efficient homes, and our money will go to support that project as well. So there are projects that were already fairly far along that we were coming in to help at the tail end. There are others that are still waiting to have groundbreakings, but most of the money, or all of the money, should be deployed within another 18 months, and a significant percentage of it has been deployed already.
And is that for affordable housing only, or?
We tried to get a full spectrum. It's largely affordable, mostly capital A affordable, but there is some workforce housing in our program. There's some senior housing, which I think is a key component of how we solve this. One thing I should just mention, I like to, think about it in this way. There was an MIT study that said that in the United States, there are 50 million unused bedrooms every night, 50 million unused bedrooms. So the percentage of bedrooms in Vermont on a per capita basis would be 100,000 bedrooms in Vermont that go unused every night. So 3,000, 4,000 people who are experiencing homelessness in our state, 15,000, 20,000 jobs that are available but nobody can hire because they can't find housing. If we could right-size that supply and demand, we could be in a much better position. But how do we do that? We'd have to build more housing dedicated or focused on seniors so that they have an affordable place to move to and a desirable place to move to so that their home can be freed up for a young family. So I think that's one of the big strategic things we have to be thinking about over the next decade.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely in favor of that. Does the state have a strategic plan to reduce homelessness, or is this a scattershot kind of?
I wish we had a better strategic plan. You know, the state of Rhode Island is right now engaged in a statewide housing assessment where they are hiring an outside firm to look at how many homes do they need, where do they need to be in the state, what type of homes do they need to be, starter homes, multifamily homes, senior homes, and then Rhode Island is gonna execute against that plan. I believe it's a decade-long plan. It would be great to have something like that in Vermont, because then it provides us a roadmap to what exactly do we need, and then how are we year by year gonna work toward that goal.
Is it a priority, homelessness, for the governor, for the state?
I can't speak to the governor, but I will say for me and for our office, housing, which I see as the key driver of homelessness, is the number one issue. It's the number one economic issue. It's the number one societal issue. So whenever there's an opportunity for our office to advocate or to implement a program, we will do it because it is the top issue in my opinion.
Okay, can you speak to the economic impact of homelessness and the costs and benefits of addressing it?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to start with the lack of housing and the economic challenges that come from that, you know, you can talk to any employer in the state and say, you know, how are things going? They'll say, boy, they're going well, but I'd like to expand and I can't because I can't hire somebody because they can't find housing. You talk to a hospital CEO and they say, boy, I offered a job to a specialist or a primary care doctor. They loved it here, but they turned it down because they couldn't find housing. Same with teachers. We used to have positions where you'd have dozens and dozens of applications for a teaching position, and now they're critically hard to fill. So the lack of housing, in my opinion, is holding back the full potential of the Vermont economy. Things are going really well in Vermont in many different ways, but because of this lack of housing, we're not able to take full advantage of it. In terms of some of the costs, you know, not having enough housing is impacting our healthcare system and impacting our healthcare costs. You know, there's that accessibility piece that I just mentioned, not being able to hire doctors so that you can't actually go and see the doctor. I'm sure people in this room have had trouble with medical wait times in recent history. It's usually the case in Vermont. And it's hard when you can't hire doctors and can't hire specialists because they can't find housing. In terms of the cost side of the equation, we've had to hire traveling nurses over the last 4 years that are much more expensive than traditional nurses. Part of that's driven by the fact that a traditional nurse can't find housing in the community, and they turn to being a traveler because they've earned so much more money, and the hospitals in turn have to hire them because it's what's available. And then, of course, the individuals that are experiencing homelessness, they have a lot more medical needs when they're living unhoused, and those medical needs are being met at the emergency department, which is the most expensive place for medical care to be delivered. And oftentimes it's being absorbed into the medical system because they don't have health insurance or don't have other ways to pay for the health care. So it's driving up the cost of health care by not addressing this problem. It's impacting our economy. And I'm sure you've all heard it from your friends or from your family. Certainly you hear about it in Burlington, that it's impacting people's desire to be downtown or go downtown or to travel to a particular community. So we're a tourist-based economy here in Vermont. We're heavily dependent on tourism, and if that starts to erode, then that is a much broader economic issue that we're going to have to deal with. So I think the costs of not addressing it, to your question, Joyce, are quite profound.
Yeah. Okay, that's going to take a minute to absorb. Wow. Okay, I'm going to move on to Elizabeth, who has some solutions for this. And I think this is a press release, the report that you made of some goals that you've reached. If you want to start out by telling these people what you have done?
Yeah, hi, I'm Elizabeth Bridgewater with the Windham and Windsor Housing Trust, and we're both a housing provider for rental housing and also for homeownership housing. And then we have supportive services that are provided both in-house with in-house staff, but also through partnerships like my colleagues here, Groundworks and Sevka and other community partners in the room. So we're a housing provider and helping to ameliorate homelessness, but also helping people maintain housing stability, and that's a critical piece of what we do. We have 887 apartments throughout Windham and Windsor County. 530 of them are in the greater Brattleboro area. Two permanent supportive housing communities that are specifically providing homes to folks that are exiting homelessness. And 25% of our housing across the two counties is the residents that live in those homes are being supported in some way by a community partner or by our in-house programming through our SASH program and SASH for All. So we've got a lot of work in this area, and so I'm delighted to be here to talk about it.
Could you just explain SASH?
Yeah, SASH stands for Supportive Services at Home, and it's basically providing support services where people live. It's a population-based model, so folks can access the support at the level that they want. So they might come to a community dinner or come and get their blood pressure checked through a blood pressure clinic, and they might sign up for more extensive one-to-one support with helping access medical services or helping with transitions when they're, say, an older person who might be leaving the hospital after a medical event and they want some help navigating that transition. When is the right time to come home? What support services do they need once they get home? Do they need any additional help once they come back home after a medical event? So that's an example of the SASH program.
Thank you. I will read this if you don't want to brag. I think you should. This is from a report from the Housing Trust. We advanced 2 new construction projects through the design and permitting that will result in 25 new homes in Windsor Village and 25 new homes in Putney Village. 7 of our earliest buildings, a combined 26 units in Brattleboro and Windsor, underwent extensive rehab to tighten efficiencies, accessibilities, and upgrade systems. We've added 9 new shared equity homes that will remain affordable to future generations of homeowners. And as Elizabeth knows, I'm in one of the older ones.
I think you were one of the originals.
Yeah. And SASH for All, you just explained that. So Housing First is a term for providing getting people off the streets into homes and then providing the services that they need. And you have done that, at least at the Lamplighter. I don't remember what you call it now, but...
Great River Terrace.
Okay. That is part of that model, isn't it?
Yeah, the Housing First model basically removes the barriers for entry. So there's no requirement that somebody has sobriety or somebody has a job. It really is saying, you know what, you need a roof over your head and you need it right now. And we're going to say, yes, come on in, we'll give you a place to stay. But it's not housing only. It comes with supportive services. And so our core partner, and I know Libby will talk more about this, but our core partner in those supportive services is Groundworks Collaborative. So they have staff on site throughout the day and in some cases in the evening, and really working closely with residents to provide the support that they need to maintain housing stability. And I think that's one of the topics that I wanted to highlight is housing stability and housing retention. I don't know if you're going to ask me this question, but I will say that one of the challenges I think that we're seeing across Vermont is that the funding that's available is very much geared towards housing acquisition, which is important, right? Because we want to get people into a new home. But we see less robust funding for housing retention once somebody's in that home. There's a lot of piecemeal, different small pots of money that are very narrowly targeted with lots of requirements attached to them, and they don't always align. And so it's like kind of a patchwork of services to help people maintain their housing. And I think that's a critical piece, is making sure that once people have a home, they maintain that housing stability. And there's a lot that goes into that, and I won't go into all the details because I don't want to steal Libby's thunder, but it's really important work. And housing stability is a key component to solving homelessness, because we don't want to have people just recycling through a home, both for their own stability and their own mental health, but also for the health of the housing system. It's very costly to go through that cycle, and we're a very mission-driven housing provider. We don't want to put anybody through that cycle. So it benefits the community, it benefits the individual, it benefits the organizations that are serving folks to maintain their housing stability. And so I think when I think of one of the key policy changes that could be made to help solve this crisis is to really develop a statewide system. Mike talked about, he wished that there was a 10-year plan. Well, actually, there is a 10-year plan that's been drafted this year, and it includes new homes. It includes new shelter capacity. It includes money for supportive services. There's actually a bill that is asking for funding for year one. It got really great traction in the House. It passed overwhelmingly in the House. It's sitting in the Senate right now. It's not getting the warm reception in the Senate that we were seeing in the House.
Are you talking about 829?
Yeah, and so that's challenging, because I think everybody wants to see forward-thinking, strategic thinking. They want to see solutions, but that costs money. And there was a plan put together that said, here's the capacity of the housing system and what we can realistically do over the next 10 years. So it wasn't a housing needs assessment. It was, this is what the capacity can handle, and this is what it's going to cost. And let's get started this year. And so that debate is happening right now. So if that's something that interests you, you can get involved in that debate and you can make your voice heard. Right now, there's a strong focus on regulatory reform. That's critical. We are totally in support of regulatory reform. It's a really important piece of the puzzle, but it's a small piece, in my opinion. Regulatory reform is not going to build new housing. And I'll give you an example, because we've got a lot of pro formers that we work on in different housing development projects. So in one example, we have, I think Mike mentioned there was a delay in one of our projects. And so we had, in a 2-year delay, the cost of construction went up by $4.6 million. So that was just from 2 years. So the cost of construction has been escalating, and that has a real impact, right? The cost of the permit went up by like $200, right? And so, not $200, I'm sorry, it went up by like $30,000. It represents 1% of the entire budget, the cost of the permit. So when you hear like that this magic bullet is going to be, we got to Act 250 reform, that's going to solve this problem. It is going to solve it in some ways, but it's not going to build new housing. What's going to build new housing is financial investment. That's what's going to build new housing in Vermont. And so we need to really think that through very carefully about how we can fund that. And there is a plan in place. And I think it really needs to be considered seriously.
Okay, I was going to bring up the problem with that project it's called NIMBY. I think we all know what it means, not in my backyard. And you hit a wall in Putney with that project. And are there ways to get these projects accepted by people? I think in Massachusetts they passed a law saying that towns had to build in town centers, and some towns just said, no, we're not going to do it. I don't care what law we don't want change. And you've come right up against it. Could you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I would just start by saying there's a tremendous amount of support in Putney for this project, and we're really grateful for that. And there is a small group of people that are opposed to it, and they've gone through the process that is available to them through the legal system, and so there's nothing that they're doing that's not available through the legal system. So I think what we're seeing, I described to you what the impact on the budget was. That's a lot of housing that could get built with a variety of different strategies, whether it's shared equity, whether it's the VHIP program. You know, $4 million can go a long way to build more housing. So there's actual real consequences to this effort that's affecting everybody. I think I wouldn't say we hit a wall. I would say we hit a delay, and we're feeling really, really confident that we'll get there. So, and we're, we've got staying power and commitment to this project and commitment to housing. So we're going to see it through, and I feel like we're getting very close to the end of the line with their options. So, but in terms of preventing this from happening again, this is where regulatory reform can actually be really helpful. I think we need to make a commitment when there's a legitimate claim for permit appeal, that there's a legislative timeline for that appeal to get resolved. We're in a 2-year cycle, and the environmental court that hears these appeals, they're backed up. They've got a huge docket. It takes a long time to get it in front of them. Even with something as simple as the appeal that we're facing, it's not very complicated, the argument that's on the table and the challenge that the court has to work through. It's just that we're just waiting in line, basically, because they're backed up. So in New Hampshire, they created a housing appeals board that is exclusive for housing appeals, and they have a commitment to resolve them in 6 months. And once that's resolved, they can't get appealed again. It's like, that's done. And so that's a really effective strategy to moving things along. It engages the citizens. It gives them the right to get their voice heard, because we're not advocating for people not to engage in the process. We believe in community participation, and sometimes an appeal is a legitimate appeal. I know in New Hampshire, I think about half of the appeals got overturned and half got stayed. So they obviously saw a variety of different arguments on the table. But what they did make a commitment to was do it quickly. And I think you see this construction cost increase is how this will make a difference. It'll also make a difference in getting people homes. Like, there are people waiting for a home, and we would have been done with this project if we would have been done and people would have been moved in by Christmas. So there's a real consequence for people that are homeless, people that are waiting for homes, people that need to downsize. There's a lot of people that need new opportunities, even if they're already in a home. So the consequences are real, and so I think some of these ideas could help speed things up.
I think that's certainly true, but I'm not attacking here, but a lot of people cite drugs and drug dealers moving into housing trust properties. And that was one of the reasons I heard that the Putney people who were opposed to it. And I know there's there have been 2 votes to go ahead with this project in Putney. But the word on the street was that if you build it, they will just be full of drug dealers. How do you answer that?
Yeah, I would say Vermont is second in the country for opioid overdose deaths. Windham County is one of the highest in the country. So we're living in the epicenter of the opioid crisis in Windham County. The Housing Trust didn't create that problem. This is a widespread community problem. It's nationwide. It's hitting this community really hard, and we are responding to this problem. This is something that we care about deeply, and so it's a problem that everybody in the community needs to respond to. And so that's how I would answer that. It's a reality. There are people that are using drugs in all kinds of homes in our community. It's not just housing trust homes. We happen to be, actually it was, somebody said to me, you know what the biggest the biggest breed that has dog bites in the country? Like, what's the dog that has the highest number of dog bites? Golden retrievers. Right? Do you know why? More people have golden retrievers than any other dog. And I think, we happen to have a lot of homes. So you're seeing you're seeing more of this activity because we have a lot more homes than others. So, but it's not exclusive to the Housing Trust, and I reject that argument.
Thank you. I've got another question for you. Have you looked into the kinds of solutions of putting in campers or tiny houses, or I think you can actually 3D print a house now. I've seen pictures of it. So
I don't have a 3D
are these
printer.
things, what?
No, but we are looking at manufactured housing. We've got a project in the early stages that will have 5 new shared equity homes, and we're looking at manufactured housing for that. So I think we're doing a project in Springfield. I know it's out of Windham County, but where we're bringing in a manufactured home to replace a burned out home that was on that lot. So there are, I think what we're looking for is lower cost solutions, because we recognize that the costs are so high right now and we need to be creative. And so those are some of the things that we're looking at. I think, there was a study that Champlain Housing Trust did around tiny homes, where they did a ton of focus groups, and everybody loved the idea of a tiny home if they could have a garage attached to it, or if they could have like an extra room for storage. And when they really got into talking about it, most folks actually didn't want a tiny home. On the other hand, we do have smaller apartments, and the Snow Block has apartments that are in the 400 square foot range. Great River Terrace has apartments that are in the 400 square foot range, and when they are designed from scratch, they can be an efficient home for somebody who doesn't have a large family size or a lot of belongings. So, yeah.
Okay, well, if you get now you can hear me. Now I can hear me. If you get a tiny home, I'll take it if you put it next to a lake or a river.
I would too. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay, let's go on to Libby, who I'm sorry, you've been silent so long. Why don't you tell people what you're doing and maybe about the new shelter or something, and take it away, Libby.
Okay. Ooh, that seems very loud. Hi, I'm Libby Bennett. I'm the Executive Director at Groundworks Collaborative. We are the sort of basic human needs agency for this area, this region, and we offer food, shelter, and supportive services to about, I think we're on pace to serve 4,500 of our neighbors this year. We offer a drop-in center on South Main Street at 54 South Main, where we have 34 overnight beds and daytime services for people to come in and take a shower, to do laundry, to prepare a meal in the kitchen, to meet with a case manager, do housing paperwork. That program has existed since the 1980s it was the Brattleboro Area Drop-In Center, which was also on South Main Street. We operate FoodWorks at 141 Canal Street, which is the region's sort of biggest and busiest food shelf program, where we are rescuing, I think, $500,000 worth of perfectly good food and keeping it out of waste streams and getting it to folks who need it every year. We have a team of case managers who work in the motel program and are working with families and individuals who are housed in that program. We also have community case management for housing retention services for people who have experienced homelessness at least once before in their lives and are now stably housed in the community with the assistance of case management. Often people have a housing voucher that helps pay the difference between the cost of rent and what the resident can afford to pay. And so often those vouchers come with a requirement that somebody have a case manager. Without that case manager, a lot of folks would lose those vouchers. And so that is a service that we provide. We, as Elizabeth was speaking about, provide permanent supportive housing services at both the Great River Terrace and the Chalet. These are services designed for its permanent housing for folks who sign a lease to move in there, and is specifically for people who are exiting homelessness. And so we are there to provide that support that people might need to help make sure that they're paying their rent on time and they're establishing good landlord relationships, and getting additional services so they don't fall behind in rent and whatnot. We have a rep payee program that helps people who are on Social Security disability benefits to manage their very small fixed incomes each month. So we manage that money to help folks stay housed. It's a model that we find really useful for homelessness prevention. Dan in the back is our landlord liaison who works with private landlords and certainly works with the Housing Trust and other housing providers. Also can help people who want to put in like an ADU, an auxiliary dwelling unit, to access funding to help create more housing through the Vermont Home Improvement Program. So we're working to collaborate in terms of creating more housing where we can be useful in that, but we are not a landlord in the community. We help people to stay in their housing. It would be a bit of a conflict of interest for us to both be a landlord who may have to be in a position to have to evict someone from housing, but also to be supporting and really trying to keep people in housing as best we can. And we also have a HealthWorks Act team, which is sort of a set of services for physical and mental health for folks who have a pretty high threshold need for acute mental health challenges. Kat McGraw's here. Hello, Kat. Kat is the managing board chair for the HealthWorks Act team as a representative from Brattleboro Memorial Hospital. That team combines practitioners from Brattleboro Memorial Hospital, the Brattleboro Retreat, and HCRS, as well as Groundworks. And so it's a 4-organization collaboration that works to provide an inpatient level of care to people, specifically working with Groundworks, who need that care but don't need to be in an inpatient setting, but can really benefit from that level of care on a street level or outreach basis. And then Carly's sitting here too. Carly just helped us launch our outreach team. And so we have a team currently, 3 folks, a case manager, a social worker, and an advocate going out into the community to make connections with people who are living unsheltered in the community. So that team just launched in February and is connecting with, I think, dozens with an S. At least, I think I've heard at least 24 people on that panel. And that was prior to any motel exodus that we saw in the middle of March. So we're running sort of an array of services and trying to provide the best services we can with the most level of dignity for people.
Can you give me just an estimate of how many people are homeless in this area?
Sure. So Groundworks is also the lead agency for the statewide system of coordinated entry, and so we are making sure, together with referral partners and assessment partners here in the sort of southern part of Windham County, so everything kind of south of Bellows Falls is our region for that. And in that area, we currently have 386 households, so not individual people, but like I think it comes out to 500-something. 571, Carly says, people, individual people experiencing homelessness in the southern part of Windham County. That is about 79 families, people who, and that's the sort of data over time, sort of over the last quarter, people who initiated this paperwork over the last quarter. We had 79 families. About 219 households living in motels in Brattleboro proper.
Thanks. Wow. I don't know what to say.
Okay.
I'm overwhelmed by this topic. There are many misconceptions about who you're serving. Possibly because we're the first exit off I-91, people think that if you have free meals, we're going to attract more homeless people or more vagrants. Can I even use that word?
We don't use that word, but.
And people just want to be homeless, and people should just get a job so they don't have to be homeless. And there's a lot of, I think they're myths and misconceptions, but some people actually believe them. I think that the guy holding onto a sign outside of Hannaford's in the rain breaks my heart, and it's always someone different, but that's a job, and that's a job I wouldn't have. So can you talk about some of this and maybe explode some of these myths, or maybe
Yeah,
not?
no, certainly. We hear these myths every day from folks in this community. We have monitored over time. When folks come into the drop-in center on South Main Street, we always ask where people's last permanent address was. And so we're able to track those zip codes. And what we find is that 75% of the people who are serving in that program are from within Windham County, either grew up here, came back to live here because they had family ties and connections, have significant ties to this area. This is home, right? And when we zoom out just a little bit, if we're looking at the entire state of Vermont and counties that border Windham County, so in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, we get to 90% of the people that we serve are from right here. And Mike was talking about the research out of California. Dr. Greg Coburn was part of this massive research study. They found that people are accessing homeless services in the communities where they live, and so it just doesn't pan out that you would spend your last $200, $500 traveling to Vermont to try to come and get the $56 that you might be able to get here for general assistance when you arrive. That is, in order to get that, you would have to prove that you cut ties with any benefits that you were receiving in another state. You might be eligible to get 3 Squares Vermont or SNAP benefits when you get here, but that's for a single person could be as little as $28. So it's, I think the myth that people are coming here because our benefits are so great just doesn't pan out at all. And the fact that we know that people are not traveling here to be homeless here in Vermont based on the research that we do.
Thank you very much for saying that. Anne, did you want to say something?
I'll just add that we have research from a lot of different places showing that the vast majority of people stay in the community where they exited housing. There was a landmark study out of California, the first really representative study that was done at state level, and it found that the vast majority of people were in the community where they were last housed. And that data, that's the most robust data that we have from any place, but we see that again and again. And again, that's another myth that we hear.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to Chloe. And maybe if you could tell us what Winston, if you can figure out how to use this machine, tell us what Winston Prouty is. Why are you involved in this, and what do you usually do? And
I have no idea. No. The Winston Prouty Center, a lot of people think we only have an early learning center on site, and actually we provide supports to hundreds of families throughout the community and lots of different services. And one of those programs is Family Supportive Housing. It's a case management program for families who are at risk of losing their housing or have lost housing. We provide service coordination and support for 2 years, up to 2 years, sometimes more, to help keep housing stability. And Libby mentioned the vouchers that people, that there are requirements for that. So we serve, we have the capacity to serve, the grant is for up to 40 families. Staffing is hard because it's hard to hire people because they don't have any place to live. We right now are supporting 21 families, and it's targeted to children, families with children who have are prioritized to have a child 6 or under, but it is families of all, as long as there is a minor child in the household. And then out of that, a lot of those families were housed in the motel program during the pandemic, and that was pretty amazing that we had the political will to put a roof over everybody's head. And here, 4 years later, as we referenced, that we didn't anticipate how to sort of take it apart or how to do that well. So that gave rise to us opening an emergency family shelter on our campus. Families First was I think most people know it was a residential school for the deaf, our campus. And there are 2 buildings that were dorms. Families First, which is a service provider for folks with disabilities, they bought the Familari farm, and which is so great, and they moved out. And when that happened, it allowed us to really think about, well, how do we want to use this space now? So the motel environment is not ideal for children, and so it really felt important if we had a solution that we should step up and offer it. So that has been open a little bit over a month. There are 40 beds available, thank you, and I heard today that there are 28 beds full, so we have 12 more beds. So that's, and it's going really, 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 really well, I know, so yeah. Yes, and so, and maybe I'll just speak really briefly because I know people probably have questions. Probably the other thing I'm doing sitting up here is that we've also been talking about building housing on our campus. And there are lots of, we've been talking about it for probably a year and a half or 2 years. Of course, I thought we'd be building it by now. I'm very naive about these things, but I'm also really dedicated to making sure that if we have a resource to offer to the solution, then, or to the problem, then it's our responsibility to explore that. And so that's why we're in this space, and really feel like we are stewards of a community resource, and we are looking at developing it in a way that responds to our community. And also in a space that is open to lots of people. So our values for our organization are really about inclusion, and everybody belongs, everybody has something to contribute. And so thinking about the housing opportunity, having housing for everybody, housing that is affordable for everybody. So the whole, if you live in our community and you want to live in a neighborhood like the kind we're talking about, I want people to be able to live there, rent, own, all sorts of options. So we're in the, we came up with one conceptual design, we met with neighbors. We're learning like that was a very expensive design, so we went back to look at could we do this project without tapping into some of the tax credit programs that Elizabeth has to grapple with a lot, and sort of make it hopefully sort of a broader opportunity. And we recently finished that study and came up with using modular construction, a plan that, again, conceptual design that could, 300 units is our working number, right on the main part of campus, so campus infill. There's already water and sewer. It's a beautiful land, so it's not, we're not talking about building hundreds of houses out in the woods. It's really, how do you build a neighborhood that it's already pretty vibrant up there. I don't know who's been up there lately, but there is a lot of activity, so really taking advantage of that. And trying to get a cost that's doable, maybe even with debt and equity, and sort of figuring out how to make that work. So we got to $263,000 per unit as an average cost, which sounds like a lot, but again, conceptual. So just continuing, as Elizabeth said, finding ways that, that we can solve for this problem in our community. Gary said something about not waiting for people to come save us. This is us. This is our community. We are going to come save us. So that's why Winston Prouty is doing that, because we have something to offer, and we have really amazing community, and we're going to just, you know, we're going to dive in and keep trying to make the kind of place that we all want this to be. So we're going to need a lot of help. I think this next sort of iteration is, we need money, obviously, so I'm really working on what is the ask for that and figuring out who to ask, you know, whether it's tapping into a low interest loan or a revolving loan fund or finding investors or, you know, really putting together what that is. So we're really close to that next phase of asking and saying, here's what we need, and so be on the lookout for that.
Wow, thank you.
Can I build on something that Chloe said? It's really exciting to hear about this project and the capacity of the community that you're stewarding there. And you know, you talked about 300 units, and when you talk about the cost per unit, I'm assuming it's partly because you have a high number of units. You can spread the site costs over a high number of units, and that just brings up a topic that I think we need to grapple with, and that's density. And so another public policy kind of interest of mine is how do we prepare communities to accept more density? Because that's part of the solution. Right now, public policy is directing money towards districts, overlay districts, and state designated districts that are downtown and have smart growth principles and are on water and sewer, and that's where the competitive funding is. So if you look for a project that isn't in those locations, you're not going to be competitive for funding. And yet there are other locations that are on water and sewer that actually have a high capacity for higher number of units. And it's one of the reasons why I think some of the traditional capital A affordable housing projects are so high, is because we're using like postage stamp, lots like the snow block, where, the wall of the building is the lot line, and or infill, and these are great strategies because we want our vibrant villages, right? And we want walkable communities, but we're actually running out of those spaces. And so we need to start looking in other locations, and we need to start grappling with the issue of density. It'll help drive the cost down. It'll help produce more homes and help solve this crisis. But of course, it's not something that people are accustomed to. So how do we grapple that with it? How do we grapple with that as a community, I think, is a key question.
Okay, we have someone who's raising his hand, so you want to try? Maybe you're going to tell us how to grapple with density.
I'll do the best I can here. First of all, I want to appreciate all the effort that you guys have been putting in on this. I'd like to give it some context as someone who's been providing affordable housing for nearly half a century, talking about what the impediments are and what affects me as a housing provider. I'd like to first put a little context to this. The vast majority, 3/4 of the affordable housing units in Vermont are privately owned by privately owned housing providers. I know that the vast majority of my tenants have affordable units who are low-income people. I got into it because I was an activist to begin with. I came from a family of activists and with a public health background. The things that are the biggest impediments are not interest rates, although they do matter. The biggest impediments are my ability to control my buildings, to protect the quiet enjoyment of my responsible tenants from ones who might slip in or might fall off the wagon or whatever. That's a huge problem in Vermont. It's almost impossible to efficiently move somebody along who needs to be moved along. Another big impediment is we had back early on our efforts to reduce lead poisoning with the Essential Maintenance Practice program was fantastic. It was a great relief to have something that was workable and not punitive, unlike the state of Massachusetts, which really put a lot of housing providers out of business the way they'd handled it. The current iteration, which is very recent, after the MPs, depending on which statistics you look at, have reduced lead poisoning cases to 1 in 100 from what they were before, are now far more draconian and far less easy to manage. I think Windham Housing probably is aware of that. And for small-time housing providers, it's next to impossible to navigate, and I think that's going to cause some real problems. And at a point where it's it's not borne out by the statistics.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off there.
Okay.
Because you have run out of steam.
Anyway.
No offense, but
I want to give one little anecdote just to give you the kind of idea of what small-time local housing providers do for their tenants. And just this morning, I spent a long time with my longest-term tenant. I took him to his first physical in 4 years. I took him to the pharmacy to get his medicine. I am following through on trying to help him with a bunch of paperwork around that. I think we need to stop vilifying housing providers and start supporting them, because the main thing I wanted to say is really, in this panel, we don't have a single private housing provider, we don't have a single tenant, we don't have a single contractor or a single real estate agent, and these are people who actually are the boots on the ground that can change this. We can't buy our way out of this problem with $500,000 units. We need to support, and that means we need to stop undermining the private local housing providers. So that's my main message. Thank you.
Okay, I think because we're running, I have 3 pages of questions for the panel, but people are raising their hands, and I think we should let you talk. So, wait, go.
Brattleboro, and I have to say, whoops, I guess my mouth isn't loud enough, my voice. Anyway, thank you so much for doing this. This is wonderful. Thank you for moderating it. I have a question. I'm curious because I tried to ask it on the last forum that you did online. We have a program that was initiated by Brattleboro Area Affordable Housing. We work with, well, I'm not on the board anymore, but they work with the town of Brattleboro, and there is a program called Apartments and Homes, which would address an issue you brought up. There are lots of homes out there where, you know, obviously, people pass on, the husband, or so in-law apartments, so to speak. I know that's still in existence. I'm just wondering if there could be more of that, and if there is any plans on that. Thanks.
Somebody, Mike?
So a couple of things in terms of just policy that's been put into place. Last year, there was a bill by the legislature called the Home Act, which was looking at sort of local regulatory reform so that you could duplex, potentially triplex or quadplex, depending on the infrastructure, regardless of what the local zoning laws required. So that was an effort to try to get more homes to become duplexes and the like. The state also has a program called VHIP, which is designed to provide grants to people that want to rehabilitate or add another unit to their home. And then, of course, programs like Home Share don't necessarily mean that you're changing your home, but you're inviting somebody into your home to help you or just to live with you. So I think all of those strategies are important to try to get some of these big homes that maybe have a single occupant to be housed with a number or more people.
Okay. Next.
Hi, Fred Brunig, live in Brattleboro. I have an action item, very, very short. Bill H-829 was mentioned and as being in the Senate. Well, it's stuck on the wall, as they say, in the Senate, in the committee, in Senator Keisha Ram Hinsdale's committee, who seems to not be interested in taking action on it. So in the action item for all of us, and I spoke to both of our senators in the last 2 days, Senator Wendy Harrison and Nader Hashim, suggest writing to Senator Keisha Ram Hinsdale and urging her to take to take it off the wall and discuss it in committee so it can have some action happen. It's a great bill that, as Elizabeth mentioned, with a 10-year plan about to work towards solving the housing crisis, and so that's what you can do. Is write to Senator Keisha Ram Hinsdale, and I would suggest copying our 2 senators just so that they know that you've done that.
Thank you. That's true. There's someone in the back raising his hand. And I'm sorry, but could you give your name before you speak?
Sure. My name's Leo Schiff. I have a data question first, and then a comment or a question. Would one of the panelists be able to tell us the different numbers for the January 2020 Brattleboro point in time homeless count versus January of 2024?
Carly probably is the best person to answer that, but I think it was 214 was 2020. And what we saw once the pandemic hit and we started counting realized that there were folks that were undercounted. And so some of the rise in the numbers that Libby described, which I think was 415, is that what you said? I can't remember what you said.
386 households.
Yeah, so we're seeing a large increase. Some of those, I think, were people that were undercounted. And then some, I think, are new folks that have entered homelessness.
So none of the panelists have the actual numbers from those point-in-time counts?
I can tell you exactly where to go to look it up. If you go to Helping to House Vermont, it's the state coalition that runs the point-in-time count, and all of the data is there. So Helping to House, visit vt.org. And because I don't have it off the top of my head, but I could try to look it up here for you while we're. Oh, thank you, Star.
Well,
Star's looking it up in the back.
Well, I would take 2023. Here's my point. We have this question. I think most of us would have the aspirational idea of housing as a human right. But that might not be something that can be accomplished in a community or in a state. That may be something that really requires a lot of federal policy. But it seems like we have the idea in Vermont that shelter might be a human right. And so I'm curious what the panelists think the difference between the impact of putting people in motels for between $3,000 and $6,000 a month versus larger congregate shelters to meet the shelter as a human right emergency. I wonder what the thinking is on that. And you could start with that, Libby.
Thanks, Leo. I think that one thing that we realize at Groundworks is that there's no one size fits all for everybody. People have different needs, and someone who might do well in a motel room might not do well in congregate shelter, and vice versa. And so I think what we know is that we need all forms of housing. We need more of every kind of housing, and we need some versatile ideas on shelter. So while we know that being in a motel is certainly better for someone who can't live without their oxygen machine, et cetera, someone who can't be camping unsheltered in the community, we know that for some people they might do pretty well in the style of shelter that we have on South Main Street is one congregate, essentially big room, and that doesn't work for everybody. So, when we think about how we will reimagine the shelter on Royal Road, we think, maybe we want to have bedrooms, and that for some people, a slight amount more privacy will be a better setting for them to move along in their sort of journey toward permanent housing. Does that help a little bit, Leo? Okay, thank you.
Okay, there's someone else who wants to talk. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll get to you right after him.
Hi, I'm Isaac Evans France. I live here in Brattleboro. And thank you to the panelists for what you've shared with us, the information, and also thank you for the work that you do. Mike and Libby and I all were at Brattleboro Area Middle School at the same time, so it's kind of fun to see you on this panel where you're doing all this really important leadership work. I'm interested in this thing that's happening on November 5th in this country, and I'm thinking back to, and I realize that most of you probably are serving in a nonpartisan role and can't say anything to endorse or oppose any particular candidate, but I'm remembering that President Reagan had something to do with defunding affordable housing, and we might have him to thank in part for the homelessness situation in our country, which Brattleboro is part of. And I'm interested to hear what difference you think there would be between the housing policies of the presidential candidates and what would this election potentially mean for homelessness in Vermont? Thanks.
Wow. And who is going to speak to that?
I can make a comment. you know, one of the biggest funding mechanisms for affordable housing development in the country is the low-income housing tax credit program, and it's a way to generate private equity dollars. And I think that is a source of funding that is widely supported by people from across the aisle. And we're advocating to expand that program right now. It's getting some traction in Congress. I see that as a focus because it's used in lots of different communities. It's used by private developers as well as nonprofit developers, so it has broad utility, and it can serve a variety of different types of community needs. So when I think of what will happen, depending on who's in office, I feel like that's a key focus, and it happens to be the largest source of funding for affordable housing. So I don't know what else will happen, but I know that's what I'm going to keep my eye on. The low-income housing tax credit program. Basically, you get an allocation of tax credits for a particular project, and you sell those to a private investor, which is typically a bank. Brattleboro Savings and Loan, for example, has bought tax credits and funded projects here in Windham County. Mascoma Bank, TD Bank, People's United. So a lot of names that you recognize when you think of private equity. That's who we're talking about.
Okay, Anne wanted to say something?
Yeah, I'd add, excuse me, I'd add two pieces to that. We see a national effort by some groups to undermine some of the proven strategies to end homelessness. You heard a little bit of discussion of housing first, a strategy that's backed by decades of research, and there are some think tanks and other groups that have been pushing for a long time to defund some of those strategies or to undermine them. So that's one of the things that I'm watching. We're also seeing a broader movement to criminalize homelessness. Many of you know that the Supreme Court was hearing arguments yesterday in a case, and so that's the other thing that we should be watching right now as we look to the election.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Let's hear from you, and then I think we should talk about the Supreme Court a little. We're running out of time, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm Elizabeth Harris Warner, and I live in the village of Putney. And I'm not for this project because of the size of the building. I am for extensive housing, diverse housing. I'm also pro cottage cluster housing, more senior housing, and a lot of the people who are against this project are not NIMBYs, and yet we are constantly being labeled as NIMBYs. The name calling is not effective. It's really not helping the community of Putney come together, and Putney is in crisis. When Mike Pieciak talks about Vermont is a tourism-based state, where is the economic basis for Putney? We have very high taxes. I'd like to see the opening of our town be a welcoming community green space that the Housing Trust can collaborate with the community on. There are a number of developers, micro developers, a lot of female developers in Putney who are working very hard to work with the VIP 2.0 funding, the VHFA funding, to bring on more gentle infill housing, which our 2005 housing study showed is what we want. We've actually walked and talked to the neighbors. I have gifted 6 acres of land to one of my neighbors because it was a featured property in the 2005 housing study. So stop calling me a NIMBY. I have been bringing on housing in the last 2.5 years, and it didn't cost me $468,000 per unit. We have developers, designers, and local contractors who are working really hard to bring more housing on that is appropriate for our town. I wouldn't want to live on 0.91 acres that's 40 feet high that is not going to allow our community garden to thrive or expand, or our farmer's market. Elizabeth herself, when she originally pitched Plan C, which was lower duplexes, pitched a gazebo that the whole community could come to, and an opportunity for the farmer's market, which serves our tradespeople, our farmers, and our nonprofits to expand. So I'd like to see Windham and Windsor Housing Trust work collaboratively with the small micro developers to take that $4 million and bring 24 more units online. We are working hard to do that. And I'd really like to stop being called a NIMBY when I have been bringing housing online at a fraction of the cost.
Okay,
So thank you.
Elizabeth, you want to? answer that?
Yeah, I would just say I feel really proud of the collaboration that we have in Putney. We've worked with the community gardens and we worked with the farmers market, and we came up with a vision for the site that preserved both of those uses. And we have an option agreement for them to buy a portion of the land. We made that commitment when we identified this site for housing. Before we even set pencil to paper on what we were going to build there, we said, let's sit down together and figure out how to meet these three goals. We want the farmers market to remain on site, we want the community gardens to remain on site, and we want to build housing in the village of Putney. It's on water and sewer. It was actually identified in the town plan as a great location for housing. It meets all the state policy goals. It's an incredible location for housing. Some people don't like the density. This is why I brought this question up, right? It's a hot flash question. And it's a legitimate one. It goes to the heart of like what our communities look like. And so I think it is something that we need to grapple with. We have a housing crisis, and infill housing and incremental development is something that we support. We run the VHIP program. We brought online 75 units in the first year. It was a huge accomplishment. We had originally projected 25, and we did 75. The governor just released a press release showing the results. Turns out Windham County has the highest utilization of the VHIP program. So we're doing our part with all the different tools in the toolbox. So VHIP's an important tool, infill development's an important tool. We just worked with a community in Londonderry to build one house. So we're not against those strategies, but we need every strategy on the table. It's a all hands on deck approach, and we need more housing. So I'm proud of the work that we're doing there. I'm looking forward to breaking ground. I hope all of you will join us. We're going to have a big party when we break ground in Putney.
Okay, I'm going to have to, okay, Chris, and then we're going to stop. But say your name when you get the mic.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Chris Trebert. I live in South Newfane. Question I would like to ask regards short-term rentals and houses that are bought as second homes. Both of those two things take a house out of the market for affordable housing or housing at all for local people. And also an incident that I hear often, and I don't know how often this happens, but houses that are bought, largely maybe people from out of state, that have tenants living in them that get evicted because the house is going to be renovated and then charged at a higher rate, which again means loss of housing. So I'm wondering if there's anything legislatively that's being talked about that or can be done about that. I know some towns are talking about limiting short-term rentals, which I think is a great idea, but I'm just wondering if there's any action on that. Thanks.
Can anyone talk to that? You want to tackle that? Mike, do you want to?
Well, just on the short-term rental piece, I think you're right that it's right now a town-by-town issue in some towns. Like Burlington have put some pretty aggressive regulations in place. Others have decided not to. But it does add to that 100,000 unused bedroom number when you have short-term rentals, because oftentimes they're not being fully used. And when they are being used, it's by folks visiting Vermont and not living here. So, you know, again, tourism's great. We need people to stay here, and there are parts of the state that don't have a lot of accommodations for tourism. So, you know, short-term rentals play a role, but the growth in them is concerning, particularly in the middle of a housing crisis. So there's been discussion about statewide policy. It hasn't gone anywhere. I think right now the strategy is letting individual towns sort of land on strategies that work, and then maybe at some point that would get brought up to a state level. But it would be concerning to continue to build housing only to have a significant portion of that housing go to short-term rentals. So I think there are a lot of different balances you could strike. I mean, you could sort of keep everything as it is for existing housing and then put restrictions on new housing in terms of what percentage could be short-term rental. In terms of the other question about secondary homes, you know, there has been a discussion about putting a surcharge on the value of a certain home. And I think that in some ways, depending on how you frame it, could be getting at that issue. So you can own a very very fancy multi-million-dollar home in Vermont that you use as a vacation home. But, you know, maybe you should pay a little bit more on that home so that we can use that money to then build more affordable housing. So those are conversations that have been having. None of them at the state level have been finalized, but the conversation's certainly very active.
Okay, I'm going to almost close, but I think we really need, and I would like to hear from everyone about the Supreme Court case that is going on right now. And it's essentially a criminalization of homelessness. And it seems to be very, very specifically, it's a town called Grants Pass in southern Oregon. It has 400,000 people living in it. They have homeless people camping in parks and in public land. There are problems because of defecation and urination, which are legitimate concerns, but there are also, do we want to put, what can we do with these people, and can we punish them for being homeless? And I think it's a really important case. I don't know how the Supreme Court is going to end up on this one. I have a horrible feeling that it's going to be the wrong way. But what do we think about it here? We're doing just the opposite. We're doing everything we can to help homeless people. And criminalizing them is going back to the old Woody Guthrie days, where you just move them along. Does anyone want to talk to that, or does anyone on the panel? Okay, we have a takers. Anne.
I'll take that one. So we have a lot of research showing that criminalization of homelessness is ineffective. It's harmful, and it's really costly, not only to the individuals who are experiencing homelessness, but also to the communities that are adopting policies to criminalize homelessness. I'd say at the same time, we also have a lot of evidence showing alternative approaches to solving homelessness. We haven't brought them to scale. We haven't invested in them enough. And so I'm hopeful that we'll really look to those approaches over widespread criminalization of homelessness.
Thank you. Nat? What?
I was just going to say, what the Supreme Court is looking at is this cruel and unusual punishment to tell someone, not only can you not put up a tent in a public park, or maybe you can't have a sleeping bag, you can't even in some communities roll up a T-shirt and lean your head on that T-shirt without getting a citation or a fine. And so, and in a community where there is not an open shelter bed for someone to sleep in, we are literally fining people for the human need to sleep somewhere. And so that's what they're talking about in the Supreme Court right now. And obviously, the question is, does it conflict with the amendment that says we shouldn't punish people in cruel and unusual ways that do not fit the severity of the crime. So if the crime is trying to get an hour of sleep in a place where you have nowhere else to go, then that's cruel and unusual.
Yeah. Lynn?
No, Massachusetts does too.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, go ahead. Wait, get a microphone, give your name. And keep it brief because we are over time now. Sorry, but we are.
My name's Kurt Dimes. We shouldn't be too complacent about Brattleboro's standing on these kinds of issues. Brattleboro is prosecuting a nonprofit organization for starting a homeless shelter in RVs here in town, and it's very much a violation of the Martin versus Boise decision. It's criminalizing homeless people and an organization which is helping homeless people.
Okay. I think we're out of time, and more out of time than we we should be. And none of my questions, my 15 great questions for the panel, have been asked or answered. So we have to come back tomorrow and do this again, I hope. Yeah. So I want to thank the panel who have been brilliant. And we've only scratched the surface, everybody. Let's keep working on it. And I think Lynn wants to say goodbye. Lynn, you want to say goodbye?
Sure. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And it's such an important issue. We really are going to do some more of these panel discussions. We do have one coming up in May on opioid use disorder, which will be probably on Zoom. These in-person events are terrific, but they take a lot of time and effort, more than going on Zoom. And I know that tonight a lot of people are also watching on Zoom, and so keep in touch with us. We thank you for coming, and thank you again to the library, Brattleboro Community Television, and we'll be back.